Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Who has heard that poem before? Many of us probably already know this poem by Emily Dickinson, considered one of the greatest poets of American literature. All her poems, you may not know this, but all but 10 of her poems weren't published until after her death. You may not know that Emily Dickinson was a recluse living on the family homestead in New England most of her life. Many scholars believe that she suffered from severe depression, debilitating anxiety. You may not know that she wrote nearly half of her poems in a certain period of time during the Civil War. Though she never explicitly names the Civil War in her poems speak to her community, her nation in turmoil. And you may not know this, but she was an accomplished botanist, well known for her gardening skills, more so than her poetry at the time she lived. And when she died, she was buried with her favorite flowers, orchids, violets. She loved flowers. She was, I would say this morning, a prophet of hope. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. I find those words more important these days when hope feels overwhelmed by the world around us, right? Images, the tragedy, the war in Ukraine, fears about the COVID variant coming back, just continuing reports from the United Nations about climate change and global warming just seem more and more depressing, hopeless. To be honest, I think we all could very easily be like Emily Dickinson, anxious, depressed, retreating into our homesteads, seemingly without hope. And yet, this woman wrote those words of hope as things with feathers that perches in a soul and sings the tune without the words, never stopping at all. She wrote them amidst her own personal struggle, amidst the national communal structure. Hope could not be overcome by any storm, personal or communal. She was truly a prophet of hope. Now, Isaiah, like Dickinson, was a prophet of hope. The words we read this morning, if you watched on the screen, the words I read for you were a poem of hope he writes for his people in exile, a people far from their home, their lives uprooted, their identity as a nation, their identity as a religious people simply torn from them. They were a people anxious and depressed. So Isaiah writes to them and uses this interesting image. Poor and needy, seeking water, and there is none. Their tongues are parched with thirst. I love that image. It's a metaphor for those times when I feel hopeless, my tongue parched with thirst. But Isaiah writes, God will not forsake them. I will open rivers, he says, on the bare heights, fountains in the midst of valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry lands springs of water. His people thirst, Isaiah says, but God provides. And these words particularly have a particular meaning for people who live in a very dry climate, who live on the very edges of the desert. Water is hope. And then come these few lines. I will put in the wilderness the cedar, the acacia, the myrtle, and the olive. I will set in the desert the cypress, the plane, and the pine together, so that all may see and know, all may consider and understand that the Lord of the hand has done this, the Holy One of Israel has created it. So to find hope, what does Isaiah do? He points to the trees. He says, look at the trees that are rooted at the edge of the desert. And not just one tree, but a variety of all kinds of trees, a kind of wilderness at the edge of the desert, a sign of and symbol of hope. Isaiah is pointing to nature. The abundance of trees at the very edge of the desert to show of roots rooted deeply searching for water, but of trees nourished and blooming despite the desert. The very evidence, Isaiah is saying, the very answer to their hopelessness is to see the abundance of grace right there, right before them. And it reminded me of another prophet of hope, Henry David Thoreau, poet, philosopher, naturalist, an abolitionist, a man who worked in the early part of the 19th century, who constantly worked to abolish slavery. And in many ways, he would have confessed to a sense of hopelessness to overcome that profound sin in his country. And he found himself anxious and depressed and without hope. A country that after his death will soon go into war over that slavery. And Thoreau was famous for a book he wrote because what he decided to do, it's called On Walden Pond, he described what he decided to do. He says, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. To front only the essentials of facts of life, and to see if I could not learn what it had to teach me, and to not, when I come to die, discover that I had not lived. Thoreau, much like Isaiah's words thousands of years before, went to be nourished in hope by trees. And he was a prophet of hope, pointing to the trees of Walden Pond. And I don't think it is simply a coincidence that these three prophets of hope, so separated by hundreds of years, who see God in the lavishness of nature and trees, who find that as a source of hope for them. Dickinson, in her celebration, her work in creating gardens and the abundance of beautiful wild flowers she grew in that garden. Thoreau, in the generosity, the woods he went to live among for a long time, he purposely lived in. Isaiah, who points to the variety and bounty of trees growing at the edge of a desert. They find hope in creation because they see most profoundly the truth expressed about God in creation and nature. The abundant, wild grace of God. Because you can't see the trees, the abundance of nature around you and not realize that hope is not about seeing scarcity. It's about embracing the abundance that surrounds us. And the truth is, one cannot really truly hope One cannot really truly open one's heart to creation without seeing the abundant grace of God all around us. And isn't that the heart of the message of Jesus Christ? This vision of God, which was not about scarcity, right? Not to see God's love as something only to be meted out to those who deserve it, right? Or only meted out to those just like us. Not to see God's love as only confined to one people or one community. Not to see God's love as small and selfish. God's love is everywhere. And its waters, Jesus would say, quench the soul. Jesus was the ultimate prophet of hope. Now, we've not focused much this Lent on sin and death, appropriate topics for the season of Lent, traditional concepts to reflect on. But instead, we have tried to root our Lent in the truest sense of the word. The Latin word for spring is Lent, which is pointing to the truth of this season when creation springs forth, and it's always abundant, isn't it? The buds coming out on the trees, the wildness of the flowers growing, the generosity of the color green. That is where we find hope if we look for the abundance in creation around us. I'm going to do a little show and tell this morning, a couple of things. One is I'm sure you have noticed every Sunday morning, because your eyes not simply on me, but the crosses in our sanctuary. Notice, does anybody know what kind of crosses they are? They are Celtic crosses, sometimes called the circle cross. And of course, what you have is the image of the cross representing, for us, a primary image for us as followers of Jesus. Now, I had a conversation with Hannah this morning a little bit about this, that one of the differences between our cross and, say, our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters is that in their crosses, the body of Jesus is always present on them. Have you ever noticed that in the Catholic Church? And in part, in that tradition, they really focus on the death of Jesus on that cross. They focus on the bodily killing of Jesus on the cross. In our tradition, we don't focus on that. We see a cross emptied of that body, a cross that points to a different reality, to life, to resurrection. That's why our cross does not have a body on it. But do you know, in the Celtic cross, which is thousands of years old, the difference is the circle in the cross. And you know what that circle represents? Actually, there's all kinds of symbolism in it. But what that circle represents is the cosmos. That circle represents nature around us. So the Celtic cross, the very cross that you worship with every Sunday, is a cross that celebrates how resurrection is present in the cosmos and in the earth around us. It's an amazing image to reflect on each and every Sunday, that sense of life and resurrection in creation and in the cosmos. So many of you maybe have heard this quote, and I think it's an important quote. And I don't know where it comes from. I've seen it on Facebook, which is the source of all quotes these days, right? I think I read somewhere it was an Indian proverb, and that the quote is that the true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. The true meaning of life, I would say the true meaning of hope, is to plant trees under whose shade you never expect to sit. It's a true act of hope. And again, my last show and tell I promised this morning. If you look out here right around our porch area, you will see these small trees. And they were planted, Jim, how long ago were they planted? Where's Jim? How long ago did we plant those? And they were planted in memory of, and because there was a long-term member, Margaret Welsh, who, most of you, I suspect most of you never met her. She was actually, when I came to Heartland, she was homebound, was unable to come to church, but she was an important part of Heartland. And she left money to the church, and there were a number of things that she would love to have done, but one of the things that we identified, I think, that a part of her legacy is to plant these trees under whose shade she would never sit. A great example of hope, right? But that's what we're supposed to be, or prophets of hope, aren't we? We're supposed to point to hope. And we plant trees. It's what we're supposed to do as church, as disciples. We're supposed to plant these trees that we don't expect to sit under the shade. What is Christian education? Or teaching our children and youth, but planting a tree under whose shade we probably won't sit, right? Most of us who've supported and cared for the refugee family that's come, that we've provided resources to, financial things to put in their homes, a welcome that we get. And for most of you, you will never get to meet that refugee family. But that's an act of hope, isn't it? To plant that tree that you never expect to sit under its shade. That's our calling, and that's our job, and that's our hope. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.